Today I'm here with Upper Darby High School teacher and frankly middle class, Mr. Bourgeois. It's nice for you to be here with us today.
Nice to be with you guys.
How did you get started with social studies? What made you think that talking about our past can help people in the future?
I know this is like super goofy, but one of the first movies I ever saw was Muppets Treasure Island. It was like the first movie my mom ever took me to. So really young, I liked pirates. I thought pirates were cool, I thought knights were cool, and that was when I was a little kid. Now granted, my knowledge of both of those things now has me feeling a little different, but at the time, that was a really great way of getting me interested in history. And then I was always really good at math and science, so people told me that's what I should do for my job, but that was never really what I wanted to do. And when I got into college and I was going through engineering, it wasn't exactly what I thought it was going to be. It was much different, and I had always been interested in politics. I'd always been interested, especially in ancient history. I love ancient history, the Greeks, the Romans, the Egyptians, the Mesopotamians, all that stuff. So when it came to actually really thinking about my career, and I realized that this engineering thing probably wasn't going to be what I wanted to do for the rest of my life, I started thinking about what I do enjoy and what I think would bring me joy when I'm also trying to earn a living. And that brought me back to history, what I'd always loved. And I was always good with kids. I'm a really goofy guy. So I think the combination of the two just kind of came together at that moment. It really clicked. And turns out that's where I am today.
Speaking of dealing with kids, I understand that you deal with a lot of different types of people, and sometimes people can misinterpret certain events with their own biases. So how do you deal with those kinds of situations?
I think coming into a classroom and engaging in good faith is the first step to solving that problem. We need to acknowledge that everybody has biases. I have biases myself that I've had to unlearn. And when you're in a leadership position, that's something that you need to actively think about and work on yourself. So it's completely understandable that if I'm still working through this, there's going to be children who have these same things. And I think that dialogue and getting to the root of misunderstandings is kind of how to address that problem. Figuring out why a student who says something that's disrespectful to a certain ethnicity, why is that disrespectful? Making that clear to them and figuring out if they know in the first place or if they're making a conscious choice. Once you get to that point, it starts to shift the onus onto the individual. But dealing with it, like you said in your question, how do you approach that? It all has to do with trust and understanding that not everybody is going to get things right away. Sometimes it's going to take a moment in their life where they see something and realize how things work. My job is to get that process started, hopefully figure out a way to solve any possible problems, but at the same time being there to engage and being there to listen to those biases and trying to work through them.
Yeah, and that's easier said than done, right? Because again, as you said, people have their own biases, and it can influence how they think. They can trap themselves inside of an echo chamber if they don't treat it. If they don't treat it properly. And I understand that you yourself have your own limitations, and I want to know if there are any specific insightful moments in your career where you weren't able to solve a problem.
One way I can answer that question, I guess, would be in a circumstance where my own biases were kind of confronted. And I think one thing that taught me a lot about this was when I was in college, I was a tour guide. And being a tour guide, I'm not gonna lie, it was fun. It was a blast. I got a lot of experience in public speaking, it went really well. But at Penn State, we did have a diversity problem in that tour guide group. We were typically picking from, privileged people who hadn't really dealt with a lot of the circumstances that have to do with biases. They hadn't been discriminated against. They hadn't seen necessarily these types of events happen. And we were having a conversation with one of the leaders of the Black Student Union. He was an adult worker who worked in the program, and I asked him, hey, what could, if I'm with a group of people who are from, a more ethnic community, what should I do on my tour? Like, are there any certain things I should say? How should I conduct myself? And during that year at Penn State, there had been some very high-profile incidents of racial slurs being used. There was Black Lives Matter protests were starting at that point in time. They were starting to grow. There had been a die-in at the student union. There had been some comments about the people who participated in that protest. And the guy, when we're talking about what I could do, he asked me, do you think things are getting better at Penn State for people of color? Obviously, I knew about these events, but I didn't want to admit it was happening. So in my answer, I tried to downplay it, and I said, hopefully things are getting better. And he called me out, and he said, do you really think with these incidents that things are getting better for Black students at this school? And when he confronted me directly with that question, I didn't know what to say, because I hadn't been honest with myself. I had this idealized picture of what my school should be, and that wasn't the reality. And it made me really question my own view of what was going on. It made me think about my language and how I was downplaying things that were happening, and made me realize that if I want to be a positive force in the world for dealing with these type of biases and issues of racism and ethnocentrism, that I need to actively be speaking out against it. And I think that really was the moment that made me know that I had to care about this. The moment where I realized that me, who I thought was super woke and all up to it and knew what I was talking about, had these biases exposed right in front of all my friends too. But the thing is, I was the only person willing to raise my hand in that room. So that part, it was an uncomfortable conversation, but I always wish I could go back and meet the guy again, because it really did make me think differently about my life.
And all of us have our own past mistakes, and you being a social studies teacher, you also learn about major instances where the mistakes of other people make us reflect about our past mistakes. But another thing is that we ourselves are currently living through history. Future generations are going to look back on us, look at our accomplishments, of course, but also the mistakes that we've done. What do you think social studies as a whole will be like in the next century, where there are going to be more developments in society, more conflicts arising? Do you think it's going to progress for the better or for the worse?
I always prefer to keep a positive view of humanity as a whole. Whether that is actuality, that's up for the world to decide, but there are a lot of positive things that I do see happening in the world, along with the bad. And a lot of that has to do with youth. I have never had classes that are so willing to engage on this topic like I do right now. Gen Z and Gen Alpha make me very optimistic about the future, especially in social studies, because the conversations that I hear between students and the way that people with biases tend to come into my classroom and challenge them does make me feel good that I know people who will be in control one day are making decisions and are considering others when they do that. I think that our interconnected world with our smartphones now, moving on to, live video chats is something that is unprecedented. And I think that is what social studies is going to be in the future, is this interconnected world. Realizing how we are tied together and how our butterfly effect of actions affects other people. I do, despite what's going on, think that things are going to get better if we have these honest conversations where we admit that racism is a real problem in America, where we admit that there is religious discrimination still active throughout our society, and where we can talk about solutions to those problems. I think that social studies is a little undervalued. Knowing all the countries in the world, I do think is an important thing to know. You should know what else is happening on this planet, who else lives here, how they live, what they're doing, and when that understanding is more solid, that's when we're able to have these connections that end up positively. I do think that conflict will become more apparent. We have social media, we have things recorded, things that are said stick with you now more than ever before, I think in a positive way, because it's how we can hold ourselves accountable. So I would like to think, again, that social studies, the way it is, and moving on from the old whitewashed version of history into this new, more engaging and more honest view of the world is going to help us going forward.
Yeah, and the fact that it developed over time and formed into this diverse, complex subject matter with all different perspectives and different timelines. With all the advancements in technology, knowledge, etc., do you think that our past is responsible for where we are today, or are we just simply a continuation of that past? Is the past our prequel, or are we the sequel?
I think I like that. Is this the prequel or the sequel? There's a great quote when it comes to history education. And that quote is, "History does not repeat itself, but it sure does rhyme." And I think that is the best way to think about everything to do with social studies. We need to remember that humans, despite our differences, have been about the same for thousands of years. People have had priorities, they've had wants, they've had needs, they've had dreams, they've had setbacks. And that's something that no matter where you are in time, as a human being, is going to happen to you. We are going to have the same conversations, we're going to have the same problems, but with each step forward in time, we learn a little bit more about ourselves. And I think, some people say history does repeat. Like I said in that quote, I don't think it does. We learn from our mistakes. Sometimes we make new ones, but when it comes to the end of the day, our past has given us a blueprint for changing the future. So I don't think we are doomed to repeat what we have been before. I think every generation builds on each other, and the history of humanity is cooperation. It's not competition, despite what people might think. And I do believe that cooperation will continue and make a better future.
Well, in my opinion, that was very insightful of you, and thank you for cooperating with me today.
No problem.
And thank you all for watching.